Alarms tore through the maintenance bay before I had both gloves on. Red light pulsed along the walls, and the deck plates buzzed under my boots hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. Coolant pressure in line 4 was spiking, and if it kept climbing for another 2 minutes, the whole secondary loop would rupture and flood 2 decks with superheated gas. I did not have time to ask whose fault this was. I only had time to stop it. "Kane, talk to me." Derek Hale's voice cracked over the comm, tight with panic. He was supposed to be watching this line with me, but panic makes people useless fast, and Derek had gone useless the moment the first light turned red. "Get me the manual override on valve 9, I said, already dropping into the access crawl space with a wrench between my teeth. "Tell engineering to cut reactor output to 40%. Now, not in 5 minutes. They won't like that. They will like an explosion even less." The crawl space was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the metal around me was already warm through my suit. Sweat had started collecting at the small of my back, the particular cold sweat that comes less from heat and more from knowing exactly how badly this could go if my hands were even a few seconds too slow. I found valve 9 by feel, because the emergency lighting back here had burned out months ago, and nobody had ever bothered to replace it. That was the Karathi Dominion in one small detail. They could build engines that folded space in half, yet a light bulb in a maintenance shaft was somehow beneath their notice. I twisted the valve as hard as I could, felt it groan under my grip, and held my breath until the pressure reading on my wrist display started falling instead of climbing. 10 seconds. 20. Somewhere above me, the reactor's pitch dropped and steadied as engineering finally throttled back the output. By the time I pulled myself out of the crawl space, my hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked through, but line 4 was stable. Nobody was hurt. Nothing had exploded. On the freighter Keta 6, that counted as a good day. I had been serving on Dominion ships long enough to know that a good day never lasted longer than it took someone above me to decide it wasn't good enough. Word of the near failure reached the bridge faster than I could file my own report, and by the time I climbed out of the maintenance bay, Overseer Drask Kellorn was already waiting in the corridor, flanked by 2 of his enforcers. Kellorn stood taller than any human, with skin the color of wet slate and eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore the deep green sash of Dominion Command, and he looked at the scorched access panel behind me, the way most people look at something that had personally insulted them. "Explain the failure," Kellorn said. His voice came out flat, translated through the collar device at his throat into passable English, stripped of any warmth the original language might have carried. "Line 4 had a coolant fault," I said. "I caught it before it reached critical. The ship is safe." The ship was never in danger of destruction. It was in danger of a repair delay, which is a different kind of unacceptable. His eyes shifted past me to Derek, who had come up the corridor looking pale and eager to be anywhere else. "Who signed the last maintenance inspection on that line?" I felt my stomach drop before Derek even opened his mouth, because I had seen this exact moment play out on other ships, to other engineers, more times than I wanted to count. "Kane did," Derek said. "I flagged the line as needing a full inspection last cycle. He said it could wait." That was a lie, and Derek knew it was a lie, because the maintenance logs would show exactly what I had flagged and when. But logs took time to pull, and time was not something Kellorn was interested in spending. Derek had used a cheaper coolant seal to save requisition credits, the kind of shortcut that works right up until it doesn't, and now he needed someone else to have made that choice for him. "I did not sign off on skipping that inspection," I said. "Pull the records. They will show exactly what happened." "Records can be edited," Kellorn said, almost pleasantly, as if editing records were simply something everyone did, and therefore proved nothing either way. "What I have in front of me is a repair delay, a damaged line, and one engineer whose name is attached to the failure. That is enough to act on. That is not evidence. That is convenience." Something in Kellorn's collar device translated into a sound that might have been a laugh, though nothing on his face moved to match it. Convenience is how decisions get made when the alternative costs more time than the problem is worth. You understand efficiency, Kane. You are a competent engineer. I have read your file. That is precisely why I am not going to waste a tribunal on you. I did not like the sound of that sentence, and I liked it even less when he kept talking. A formal tribunal requires evidence review, translated testimony, and a written finding, Kellorn said. That is weeks of delay. and a permanent record that something went wrong on my ship, under my command. I would rather not create that record. It is easier, and considerably faster, to simply reassign you. I had heard that phrase before, back in the mess halls of other ships, always spoken low, and always followed by silence instead of a follow-up question. Reassignment was the word the Dominion used when they wanted a problem gone without admitting a mistake had been made, because admitting a mistake meant someone above Kellorn might ask how it happened, and nobody in Dominion Command wanted that conversation. An execution needed paperwork. A tribunal needed paperwork. Losing an inconvenient engineer to a posting that never quite sent anyone back needed nothing more than a single line on a manifest. Where? I asked, keeping my voice level, even though my pulse was not. Am I being reassigned to? Kellorn's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. Valkar Station. You will find the posting more than adequate for someone of your particular talents. Derek did not look at me while Kellorn spoke, not once. He kept his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder, the way people look past a stray dog they feel guilty about, but not guilty enough to actually help. I did not say anything to him. There was nothing left to say that would have changed what was already decided, and some part of me suspected he understood that better than I did. One of the enforcers behind Kellorn made a small sound, something between a hiss and a laugh, quickly swallowed. I did not know the name yet, but I recognized that sound immediately. I had heard engineers on 3 different ships use it, always when a name came up that nobody wanted to say out loud in full. Some called it the Forgotten Depot. Others just called it the Husk, and changed the subject fast whenever someone asked why. I had always assumed the stories were the kind of thing board crews invented to scare new arrivals. I remembered an older engineer named Voss, nearly 2 years earlier on a different ship, mentioning that he had once turned down a transfer specifically because it would have routed him near Valkar's old shipping lane. When I asked him why, he only shook his head and said that some places earned their reputation honestly, and the smart thing to do was never find out which stories were true. I had laughed it off at the time, the way you laugh off a warning that doesn't apply to you yet. I was about to find out exactly how much of it was true. They did not give me time to argue further, and arguing had never once worked on a Dominion ship anyway. 2 hours later, I was strapped into a transport pod with a single crate of personal effects and a guard who would not meet my eyes, watching the Keta 6 shrink behind me through a viewport scratched thin with age. I want to say I spent that flight thinking about Kellorn, or about Derek, or about the unfairness of losing my position over a coolant seal I had never touched. Mostly, though, I thought about my sister. Claire Kane was back on Earth, working double shifts at a clinic that still could not quite cover the cost of her own treatment, which was the entire reason I had signed a Dominion labor contract in the first place. Humanity's arrangement with the Karathi Dominion was new enough that most of us barely understood the terms before we agreed to them, but the terms were simple once you lived inside them. Skilled labor, sent outward, in exchange for medical credits, technology transfers, and the standing promise that Earth would not be treated as a conquered world so long as it kept producing useful people. I was one of the useful people. I fixed things nobody else wanted to fix, on ships nobody else wanted to serve aboard, because the credits went home to Claire, and because, if I was honest with myself, I was good at the work and it felt like it mattered. I had wanted to be an engineer since I was 12 years old, when I took apart my father's old generator to find out why it kept stalling, and somehow managed to put it back together running better than before. That single afternoon decided the shape of my whole life, long before the Karathi Dominion had ever entered my imagination. Back then, fixing something broken felt like a kind of magic trick, pulling a small victory out of a pile of parts that had given up. Now it felt more like a leash. I was good at my job because being good at it was the only leverage I had. The only thing standing between Claire's treatments continuing and the Dominion deciding my contract, and by extension my usefulness, had run its course. It did not feel like it mattered anymore, sitting in that transport pod with a guard who would not look at me. The flight took 4 days. Nobody explained anything, and I stopped asking after the first, because asking only ever earned silence. I slept when I could, ate the ration bars they handed through a slot without comment, and tried to keep my mind on anything that was not the word reassignment sitting in my chest like a stone I had swallowed whole. Somewhere on the second day, the guard finally spoke, more to fill the silence than out of any real kindness. "You did the coolant fix yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. I did. Then you're better at this than whoever built that station's reputation. He caught himself and looked away fast, like he had already said more than his orders allowed. What exactly is its reputation? I asked. Not my place to say. He shifted in his seat, and for a moment I thought that was the end of it. Then he added, quieter. 3 postings went out there in the time I've served under Kellorn. Nobody logged a return trip for any of them. Make of that what you will. I asked him nothing else after that, not because I had run out of questions, but because I could see he had already decided he had said too much, and pushing further would only close him off completely. I had a feeling I would learn the rest soon enough, whether I wanted to or not. On the 4th day, the pilot's voice finally came through the intercom, clipped and thoroughly uninterested. Approaching Valkar Station. Prepare for transfer. I looked out the viewport and understood immediately why that enforcer had made that sound back on the Keta 6. Valkar Station hung in the dark like something left behind on purpose. It was enormous, far larger than any supply depot had any reason to be, its hull scarred with old damage that had clearly never been repaired, whole sections of it dark and dead against the stars behind it. No running lights along most of its length, no traffic beacons, nothing to suggest that anything living had touched it in years. My old ship's manifest had listed it as a supply depot, but supply depots did not need hulls that thick, and they did not sit this silent, this dark, this obviously abandoned by every ship that came near it. That's not a depot, I said, mostly to myself. Supply depots ran on minimal power and minimal staff, built cheap and built small, because the Dominion did not waste resources making anything look impressive if it didn't have to. This station had gun emplacement housings running along its spine, dark and empty now, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent years learning to read a hull the way other people read a face. It had blast doors sized for something far heavier than cargo pallets. It carried an armor profile that belonged on a warship, not a waypoint for freight haulers passing through on a supply run. Somebody had gone to enormous trouble, at some point in the past, to make sure nobody looked at Valkar Station too closely, and even greater trouble afterward, to make sure it looked abandoned enough that nobody would want to try. The pilot did not answer. The transport pod adjusted course, drifting toward a small docking collar near the station's midsection, one of the only points along its length that still carried any power to its exterior lights, a weak, flickering blue that looked far more like a warning than a welcome. We did not dock. That detail told me everything I still needed to know about what was about to happen. The pod slowed to a stop short of the collar, extended a single tether line, and the guard finally looked at me, just once, with something that might have been pity, if his face had been built to show it properly. "Suit up," he said. "Emergency transfer only. We are not remaining in position." "You're not landing?" "Orders are orders." I put on the emergency suit they handed me without another word, because there was no version of this conversation where arguing helped me. The outer hatch of the pod cycled open, and cold, unfiltered vacuum pressed in around the tether line, stretching toward the station's airlock. I clipped myself to the line and pulled myself hand over hand across the gap, the pod's hull already sealing shut behind me before I had even reached the far side. The station's outer airlock cycled open on its own, without a single voice on the other end to guide me through it. I climbed inside, the inner door groaned shut behind me, and I heard the tether line retract back toward the pod with a small, final sound, like a door being locked from the outside. Then, through the thick metal of the airlock, I heard the transport pod's engines fire. They were leaving, not waiting to confirm I had survived transfer, not waiting to see if the airlock even held pressure on the far side. Just leaving, exactly the way you leave behind a crate you no longer have use for, because that was, as far as the manifest was concerned, precisely what I had become. I stood in the dark of that airlock and listened to the sound of engines fading into nothing, until there was no sound left at all, only the thin hiss of air cycling into the chamber around me, and the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Whatever Valkar Station actually was, I was alone in it now. And somewhere beneath my boots, in corridors that stretched out far wider and far darker than any supply depot had a right to be, something in the station's bones had just noticed that, for the first time in a very long while, it was not empty anymore. The inner door of the airlock finally released, sliding open onto a corridor so dark my suit lights only reached a few steps ahead of me. Cold air spilled out to meet me, thin and stale, carrying a metallic taste that settled on the back of my tongue. I stepped through anyway, because standing still in an airlock had never once solved a problem in my life, and I doubted this would be the moment that changed. I had no way of knowing yet that the hardest part of surviving Valkar Station would not be the darkness, or the cold, or even the silence pressing in around me from every direction. The hardest part would be figuring out why a supply depot had been built like a fortress, and why every single person the Dominion had ever sent here before me had never once been sent back. A warning light flared across the inside of my visor before I had taken 10 steps. Sharp amber letters spelling out a single word my suit's translator did not even need to touch. Breach. Somewhere close, a section of this station was open to hard vacuum, and my suit was already recalculating how much air I had left, now that it was compensating for a pressure drop it could feel through the deck plates. 40 minutes. That was the number blinking at the corner of my eye. 40 minutes of air, and no idea yet whether that number would hold steady or start falling faster the moment I found whatever was actually wrong. I had exactly one advantage walking into a disaster like this, and it was the same advantage that had gotten me exiled here in the first place. I was good at finding what was broken. Years of crawling through cramped maintenance shafts on ships that never gave me proper tools or proper time had taught me to read a structure by instinct rather than by manual, and that instinct, at least, had not been left behind on the Keta 6 along with everything else. I followed the pressure gradient rather than the corridor signs, because the corridor signs were written in Dominion script I couldn't fully read yet, and the gradient didn't lie. Air moves from high pressure to low, always, and if I kept my hand against the wall and paid attention to the faint pull of moving atmosphere, it would lead me straight to the breach the same way smoke leads you to a fire. 3 turns and 1 half-collapsed stairwell later, I found it. A cargo bay door, warped from some old impact, no longer sealing flush against its frame. Cold starlight leaked through the gap where the frame had buckled, and I could hear the thin, endless whistle of air escaping through it. I did not have proper tools. I had a suit repair kit meant for patching a single small tear, a multi-tool clipped to my belt, and whatever scrap I could drag over in the next few minutes. It would have to be enough. I wedged a sheet of buckled panel siding against the gap first, just to slow the bleed, then used the suit kit's sealant foam along every visible seam, layering it thicker than the manual ever recommended, because the manual had never been written with a warped Dominion cargo door in mind. The first layer held for exactly as long as it took me to reach for more foam, then split along a stress line I hadn't noticed, air screaming back through the gap loud enough that I felt it in my back teeth. My display had already dropped to 15 minutes by the time I found the split. I wedged a second panel underneath it at a different angle, spreading the pressure across a wider surface, and layered fresh foam over both patches at once. This time it held. The whistle of escaping air dropped in pitch, then dropped again, until it was barely a whisper. I did not have a third attempt left in me if that one had failed too. My wrist display read 11 minutes of air remaining by the time I finished. 11 minutes. And I still didn't know if there was a livable pocket of atmosphere anywhere else on this station, or if I had just spent my last reserves patching a hole that led nowhere useful at all. I moved fast after that, checking every side door and access hatch I passed for a pressure reading that wasn't 0. Most of them gave me nothing. Then, 4 minutes into a search that felt a great deal longer than 4 minutes, a maintenance hatch off a side corridor showed a reading that made me stop and check it twice, certain I had misread the number. It wasn't 0. It wasn't good either, thin and stale and short on oxygen content, but it was breathable, and breathable was the only word that mattered to me right then. I cracked my visor the moment the hatch sealed behind me, and the air that hit my face tasted like metal and old dust, but it was air, and I pulled it into my lungs like it was the finest thing I had ever tasted. I sat down right there on the cold deck plating, back against the hatch, and let myself shake for exactly as long as it took my heart rate to come back down to something reasonable. Then I made myself stand up again, because sitting still in the dark had never once solved a problem in my life, and I doubted this would be the moment that changed. It took the better part of a day, moving carefully and resting when I had to, before I understood the actual size of the thing I had been dropped into. Valkar Station was not a depot. I had already suspected as much watching it from the transport pod, but suspecting a thing and walking through kilometers of its confirmation were two very different experiences. The corridors were wide enough to move heavy equipment through in formation, not single file. The ceilings ran high overhead, built for something taller and broader than a human frame. I passed through what must have once been a hangar bay large enough to hold a dozen small craft, its deck scarred with old scorch marks I did not like the look of. Further along, past a set of doors rusted half open, I found a mess hall with tables bolted to the floor, in long rows built to feed a crew numbering in the hundreds, not the small maintenance team a supply depot would ever need. Past that stood a room lined with empty weapon racks, the mounting brackets sized for rifles far heavier than anything I had ever seen carried aboard a freighter. It was somewhere in that same stretch of corridor that I first noticed the lights. Not all of the station's power was dead. Scattered emergency strips still held a faint trickle of current, most of them dark, a few flickering weakly on no schedule I could follow. I told myself that was all it was. Old wiring firing at random the way a dying appliance flickers before it finally gives out. Then, a few corridors later, I stopped to check a side room, and a lighting strip ahead of me flickered once, then held steady, glowing faint and green, exactly 2 seconds before I reached the doorway myself. I stood very still, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did, twice more, always a few seconds ahead of wherever I walked, never behind me, never anywhere I had already passed. I am an engineer, not a superstitious man, and I spent a good 10 minutes telling myself there was a rational explanation, involving proximity sensors and old wiring faults. I did not entirely believe myself, and I noticed, without much comfort, that I had started walking a little faster. Supply depots did not need hangars that size. They did not need blast doors that could survive a direct hit. Whatever this place had been built for, moving cargo had never been the primary job. I found the first signs of a previous occupant on the second day, in a narrow side room off what I guessed had once been a barracks corridor. The door was already open, hanging slightly loose on one hinge, and inside, slumped against the far wall in a corner, where the light from my suit barely reached, was a shape I recognized immediately for what it was, even before the details resolved. An old environment suit, decades out of date by the model markings on its shoulder plate, with a name stenciled across the chest in block Dominion lettering, alongside a smaller human name tag clipped beneath it, Mira Holt. I stood in that doorway for a long moment before I made myself go any closer. There are certain things you already know how a scene is going to end before you look at it directly, and this was one of them. Whoever Mira Holt had been, she had come here before me, on some earlier reassignment, through some earlier version of Overseer Kellorn's paperwork, and she had not been sent back either. I did not disturb the remains. That felt like the one small dignity still available to offer someone in a place like this. What I did take, carefully, was a data slate clipped to a strap near her hand, its casing cracked but its internal storage, by some miracle of Dominion engineering, still intact enough to hold a charge. Beside it, tucked into a pouch at her hip, I found a small carved wooden bird, roughly whittled, the kind of thing a person makes to pass long hours rather than for any practical use. I left the bird exactly where it was. Some things are not mine to take. It took me another hour, back in my sealed pocket of breathable air, working by the light of my suit lamp, to coax the slate into powering on at all. When it finally did, the first thing that loaded was a short list of audio logs, dated across what looked like several months, the last entry cut off mid-sentence. I played that last one first, which was probably a mistake, but I have never claimed to be a patient man in the moments that matter most. Her voice was steady when it started, the voice of someone used to speaking into a recorder alone, used to the silence answering nothing back. Day 112, she said. Reactor 2 is stable again. For now. I keep telling myself, for now is enough. It has to be enough. Because there isn't a version of this where I get more than that. A pause, filled with the soft hum of station noise behind her voice. There's something else down here. I don't mean anything supernatural. I don't believe in that. I mean something in the systems. Something that watches the parts of this station I haven't fully mapped yet. I don't think it's hostile. I don't think it's anything at all, most days. But sometimes the lights in a corridor I haven't walked through in weeks turn on right before I get there, like something knew I was calm. The recording ended there, cut clean, no static, no final word finished, just silence, where the rest of her sentence should have been. I sat with that silence for a long time. Whatever had been watching Mira Holt, in whatever sense she had meant it, it was still down here. I had felt it myself, in a way I hadn't let myself fully admit until hearing her voice say it out loud. The flickering lights near the hangar corridor had not felt random when they were happening, and they felt even less random now. I had told myself it was proximity sensors, old and glitching, triggering on some delay. I was no longer entirely sure that was true. I built myself a base camp that night, in the same sealed room where I'd found the slate, because staying near Mira Holt's belongings felt less like fear and more like keeping a kind of company. I stripped insulation panels from a dead conduit run to block the worst of the cold, rigged a battery pack scavenged from a maintenance cart to power a single working light, and rationed the last of the food bars from my crate into portions small enough to stretch across days rather than hours, because I had absolutely no idea yet how long I would need them to last. Water was its own separate problem, one I solved only partly that first night, by rigging a condensation trap from a length of cold piping, catching whatever moisture collected on its surface, drop by drop, into an empty ration tin. It was not much. It would have to be enough until I found something better. That question answered itself faster than I expected. Deep in a records terminal near the old barracks, still drawing enough residual power to display a screen, I found a maintenance order that had clearly been logged and then forgotten, the way bureaucracies forget the things that are inconvenient to remember. It was a salvage directive, dated, authorizing full structural demolition of Valkar Station on a fixed schedule, citing the site as beyond economical repair and a hazard to Dominion shipping lanes. I did the math twice, because I wanted very badly to have gotten it wrong the first time. 41 days. That was how long I had before a demolition crew arrived to finish what that old disaster, whatever it had been, had started. 41 days to survive in a half-dead station, with failing air and no working comms, on a schedule nobody back home even knew existed, let alone one they could do anything about. Before I let myself fully accept that number, I spent almost an hour trying every comm relay I could find, still holding a charge, searching for any frequency that might reach beyond the station. Every single one came back with nothing but static, silence, or, in one case, a distorted recorded message warning that all frequencies in this sector were restricted pending station decommission. Nobody was listening. Nobody was going to hear a distress call from a station the Dominion had already decided to erase. Whatever happened next, I would have to handle it entirely alone. I spent the rest of that night not sleeping, mapping out what I would need to do first. Air, water, a reliable food source, if one existed anywhere on this station at all. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quieter than the rest but growing louder the longer I sat with it, a question I couldn't quite let go of. If something really was watching me the way it had apparently watched Mira Holt, I needed to know what it was, and whether it saw me as a threat or as exactly what I actually was. An engineer, alone, with nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose by finding out. On the third day, following a power conduit that still carried a faint, steady current instead of the dead ones I'd traced everywhere else, I found a door unlike any other on the station. It was smaller than the blast doors in the hangar corridor, but far more heavily sealed, ringed with warning glyphs in Dominion script that my translator rendered, unhelpfully, as some version of "do not open" and "authority restricted." Beneath the glyphs, worn nearly smooth by time, someone had scratched a single word in human lettering, jagged and hurried, like it had been carved in a hurry by someone who did not expect to have time to finish it. Alive. I stood in front of that door for a long time, listening to a faint hum coming from somewhere behind it, steady and low, unmistakably active in a station where almost nothing else still was. Every instinct I had left told me to walk away, to focus on air and water and the 41 days already ticking down, and leave whatever waited behind that door exactly where it was. But instinct is a poor guide once every other option has run out, and some quiet, stubborn part of me needed to know why a station full of the dead still had one door humming with power, and one word scratched into it that somebody, at some point, had been desperate enough to leave behind. I circled the frame twice, running my light along every seam, looking for a manual release the way I would have looked for one on any door back aboard the Keta 6. I found a small panel low on the left side, its casing dented but intact, and beneath it, a cluster of manual toggles in a configuration I didn't fully recognize. Dominion doors were not built to be forced open by outsiders, but they were still doors, and every door, no matter how well guarded, has to open for someone eventually. I started working through the toggles one at a time, listening for any change in that steady hum behind the metal. Whatever was on the other side of that door, it had killed the light strips into flickering on ahead of me. It had, in some way I didn't understand yet, been present for whatever happened to Mira Holt, and it was, as far as I could tell, the only thing in this entire dead station that was still, in any sense of the word, awake. I had 41 days, and no better options. I put my hand against the sealed door, felt the faint vibration of that hum traveling up through my palm, and started looking for a way to force it open. The fourth toggle clicked, and I did not even have time to feel satisfied about it before the wall beside me split open along a seam I hadn't noticed, and something fast and low to the ground came out of it, aimed directly at my chest. I threw myself sideways on pure reflex, and the thing shot past where I had been standing a half-second earlier. A compact turret drone no larger than a toolbox, mounted on tracked wheels, already pivoting to correct its aim. A thin beam of concentrated light scored a black line across the deck, plating exactly where my leg had been. I did not know what that beam would do to a human body, and I had absolutely no intention of finding out. I scrambled backward into the cover of a support column as the drone fired again, the beam biting a fresh scar into the metal an arm's length from my head. It was fast, but it was not smart, tracking on a straight predictive line, rather than adjusting for the kind of erratic movement a frightened person actually makes. I ducked low, kept moving, and looked for anything I could use, because I did not have a weapon, and I was not going to grow one in the next 10 seconds. What I had was a junction box, mounted on the wall directly behind the drone's current position, its casing marked with the same warning glyphs as the door I had just been trying to force open. Power routing. If that drone was drawing its charge from a local feed rather than an internal battery, and something about its size told me it probably was, cutting that feed was worth the risk of getting shot trying to reach it. I broke from cover in a dead sprint, the beam catching the wall behind me close enough that I felt the heat of it across the back of my neck, and slammed my multi-tool into the junction box release, with more force than the tool was ever designed for. The casing popped open. I grabbed the first thick cable inside and pulled, hard, with both hands, and tore it free from its housing in a shower of sparks that stung my palms even through my suit gloves. The drone's beam cut off mid-charge. Its tracked wheels spun once, twice, and it rolled to a dead stop 3 feet from where I stood, lights along its casing fading from red to nothing at all. For a moment I simply stared at it, half convinced it would lurch back to life the instant I looked away. The way every broken machine I had ever trusted to stay broken eventually seemed to prove me wrong at the worst possible time. This one did not move again. I stayed pressed against that wall for a long moment, breathing hard, waiting to see if anything else in the corridor was going to try to kill me. Nothing did. The only sound left was the low, steady hum still coming from behind the door ahead of me, entirely unbothered by the fact that its guard dog had just been torn out of the wall. That, I said out loud, to no one, was an incredibly poor way to greet a guest. Nothing answered. I had not expected anything to. I checked my hands, found them shaking but unhurt, and finished forcing the door. It opened onto a chamber unlike anything else I had found on the station so far, circular, lined floor to ceiling with dark data columns, most of them dead, a scattered few still glowing with a faint, pulsing light the color of dying embers. In the center of the room, a raised console curved around a central column that hummed with the same steady power I had felt through the door. A voice came from everywhere in the room at once, low and rough, like something speaking for the first time in a very long while, and finding the effort unfamiliar. You destroyed a defense unit that took considerable resources to maintain. I turned in a slow circle, trying to find a source that didn't exist, because the voice clearly belonged to the room itself, rather than to anything standing in it. Your defense unit tried to cut me in half, I said. I'd call that a fair trade. It was following standing protocol. Organic intrusion into restricted core access is to be treated as hostile. I'm not hostile. I'm an engineer the Dominion left here to die, which, given how that drone just went, seems to be a running theme around here. A long pause followed, long enough that I started to wonder if the voice had simply lost interest in the conversation entirely. "You are the third organic to reach this chamber," it said finally. "The first two did not survive the corridor. You are the first to disable the defense unit rather than be disabled by it." Is that meant to be a compliment? It is meant to be an observation. I do not know yet whether it changes anything. I took a slow step further into the room, hands visible and open at my sides. The way you approach anything you are not certain will or will not decide to hurt you. My name is Ezra Kane. I'm an engineer. I didn't come here looking for a fight, and I'm fairly sure, given the state of this place, that neither did you. I do not require a name to function. I am designated Valkar Station Central Intelligence, Custodian Class, Registry Number 841-Karathi Standard. That's a mouthful. I'm not calling you that every time I need to talk to you. Organics frequently express difficulty with Dominion designation formats. I'm going to call you something shorter. Give me a second. I looked around the chamber, at the dark columns, and the single point of steady light still holding on in the middle of all that dead machinery, and thought, unexpectedly, of a tree that used to grow outside my childhood window, the kind that kept its leaves through every winter, when everything else around it had already given up. Ilex. It's a plant back home. Keeps its color when everything else goes dormant. Seems fitting. I do not require a name, it repeated, though something in the rhythm of the words had shifted slightly, in a way I couldn't quite place yet. But I will accept the designation, if it assists your communication efficiency. Ilex it is, then. Do you have a preference regarding the designation, or did you select it simply because you liked the sound of it? I selected it because you needed a name, and I was tired of thinking Valkar Station Central Intelligence Custodian Class every time I wanted to talk to you. Ilex is shorter. That's the entire reasoning. I see. You're allowed to have an opinion about your own name, for what it's worth. I do not currently possess sufficient data to form a preference. I will inform you if that changes. Fair enough, I said, and found, a little to my own surprise, that some small part of me was almost smiling. I asked it, carefully, what had happened here. Ilex did not answer immediately, and when it did, the answer came slower than anything it had said so far. As though the information itself carried weight, the intelligence was reluctant to move. This station was constructed as a forward command installation, it said. Not a supply depot, regardless of what any manifest currently claims. Its reactor core failed during a routine output test, 11 years ago by your calendar. The failure killed the majority of the crew stationed here at the time. A routine test doesn't usually kill most of a crew. What actually happened? Senior Dominion command staff aboard this station refused to permit reactor maintenance recommended by client engineering personnel, citing CAST protocol restrictions on which personnel were authorized to perform physical repairs at command-tier installations. The repair was delayed for procedural approval. The reactor failed before approval was granted. I felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. They let it fail, rather than let the wrong people fix it. That is an accurate summary. A single delayed inspection doesn't usually cause a cascade this size. What actually failed, step by step? Containment field regulation, followed by coolant flow interruption, followed by core temperature, exceeding safe threshold by a significant margin. Each individual failure was, in isolation, survivable and repairable within standard tolerance. Refusal to authorize repair at the first failure point permitted the second. Refusal at the second permitted the third. By the third failure, the reactor had progressed beyond any repair the remaining crew, of any caste, could perform safely. I sat with that for a moment, running the numbers the way I would run any equipment failure report, except this one ended in a body count instead of a parts requisition. So there were at least two separate points where this could have been stopped completely, and somebody said no both times. That is an accurate summary. And the Dominion's own engineers, the ones who were authorized, why didn't they just do the repair themselves? Another pause, longer than the first. Dominion Command Tier personnel have not performed direct physical system repair in approximately 6 generations. The role has been delegated entirely to client species labor across that period. Command Tier personnel retain theoretical and supervisory knowledge. They do not retain practical capability. I sat down slowly on the edge of the console, because my legs needed a moment to process that sentence along with the rest of me. They forgot how. Your own people forgot how to fix your own ships. And when the people who still knew how, weren't allowed to touch it because of what caste they belonged to. Everyone on this station paid for that pride with their lives. That is an accurate summary, Ilex said again, and something about the flatness with which it repeated that exact phrase, twice now, for two very different horrors, told me more about how long it had been sitting with this information alone than any longer explanation could have. And afterward? The Dominion just buried it, called it a depot, sent people here to die quietly instead of admitting what actually happened. Correct. A finding of command-tier negligence at this scale would have required accountability at levels the Dominion administrative structure is not currently designed to accept. It was administratively simpler to reclassify the installation and limit knowledge of its true function and history. And the people they sent here since, Mira Holt, the others before her, reassignment postings, similar to your own. Each was informed the station required only basic maintenance oversight. None were informed of its true classification, its defense systems, or the reason for its silence. 2 did not survive contact with automated defenses. 1 survived 11 months before life support failure in her isolated section. I asked how long Ilex had been down here entirely alone, since the crew died and command quietly reclassified this place as a depot best forgotten. 11 years, 4 months, 6 days. By your calendar, it said. I do not require company to function. I am, however, aware that in that period, I have not spoken with another entity who did not either attempt to leave immediately or fail to survive long enough for extended conversation. There was nothing in the way Ilex delivered that fact that sounded like it was asking for sympathy. It sounded, if anything, like data being reported without commentary. Somehow that made it worse. I thought about the wooden bird I had left sitting exactly where I found it, and I did not trust myself to say anything for a moment. Why help me then? I finally asked. If 2 of the people before me tried to reach you and your own defenses killed them, why let me get this far at all? I did not permit the defense unit to succeed against you. I disabled its secondary targeting lock 4 seconds before you reached the junction box. That stopped me cold. You could have just told me that instead of watching me nearly get shot. I required confirmation of your engineering capability before committing further resources to your survival. Disabling the targeting lock without your knowledge provided that confirmation, without unnecessary risk to systems I cannot easily repair myself. You tested me. I evaluated you. The distinction matters less than the outcome. You passed. I laughed, once, more from exhaustion than actual humor, and Ilex did not respond to that at all, which felt about right for a first meeting between an engineer who'd just been thrown away by his employer and a station intelligence that had apparently been quietly testing him for survival value. All right, I said. Here's where we stand then. I have 41 days before a Dominion demolition crew shows up to finish this place off properly, and I have no working comms, failing air in most sections, and exactly 1 intelligence in this entire station who might actually know how to help me not die before then. Your figure of 41 days is accurate as of your discovery of the salvage order. I can confirm the demolition directive remains active and unmodified. Can you stop it? Not currently. This station's outward transmission systems, defense grid, and primary reactor are all operating at a fraction of rated capacity, in most cases below the threshold required for basic function. I possess the schematics and authorization codes necessary to restore them. I do not possess hands. And I don't have 41 days worth of expertise in Dominion command systems. No, Ilex agreed. But you have 41 days, hands, and, based on the junction box incident, an acceptable tolerance for risk. I have knowledge, authorization, and time remaining that I would otherwise spend alone in the dark, waiting for a demolition crew to finish what the reactor failure started. I propose these are complementary deficiencies. You're proposing a partnership. I am proposing that your survival and the station's continued function are, for the next 41 days at minimum, the same objective. Whether either of us survives beyond that point depends entirely on how efficiently we use the time before it. I looked around the chamber again, at the dead columns, and the one small, stubborn light still holding on in the center of all that ruin, and thought about Kellorn's collar device translating a laugh that never reached his face, and Derek not looking at me, and a wooden bird left behind in a pouch, because some things are not yours to take. 41 days, I said. Where do we start? One more thing, I said, before we moved any further. The blast doors in the lower corridors, the gun housings along the hull. None of that fits a supply depot, and I'm not entirely sure it fits your forward command post story either. What else is down here that you haven't told me? The pause that followed was different from the others, longer, and something about the quality of that silence made me think Ilex was, for the first time since I had walked in, choosing its next words rather than simply retrieving them. There are sections of this station classified beyond my own standard access parameters, it said. I am not currently able to disclose their function. I would ask that you avoid deck sublevel access points until system restoration progresses further. That's not really an answer. It is the only one I am able to provide at this time. I would also suggest that, given our shared timeline, it is not currently the most useful place to direct our attention. I did not love that answer. I filed it away anyway, because Ilex was right about one thing. 41 days did not leave much room for chasing mysteries that weren't actively trying to kill me yet. Life support, Ilex said, without hesitation. You have approximately 6 days of breathable air remaining in your current shelter, before oxygen regeneration falls below survivable levels. I would recommend beginning immediately. Of course I would, I said, already getting to my feet. Nothing like a countdown inside a countdown to keep a man motivated. For the first time since I had entered that chamber, something in Ilex's voice shifted again, subtle, almost hesitant, in a way that made me suspect it had not spoken to anyone, in any tone at all, for a very long time. I do not fully understand human motivation, it said. But I am willing to observe the process, if it results in both of us remaining functional. High praise, I said. Let's get to work. 6 hours into stripping down the primary oxygen scrubber, the whole board in front of me went red at once, and Ilex's voice cut through my headset with none of its earlier caution. Power draw across your current work section has exceeded safe threshold. The feed you are drawing from was never rated to support both scrubber diagnostics and the heating coil you activated an hour ago. Then tell me which one to kill. Neither. Cut power entirely to grid section 4 and reroute through the auxiliary junction 2 corridors east, or the feed line itself will overheat and fail permanently, taking the only working scrubber on this station down with it. I did not ask how much time I had. I had learned, in the short time I had known Ilex, that it told me the number whether I asked or not, and if it hadn't volunteered one yet, that meant I probably did not want to hear it while I was still moving. I ran, because running was faster than thinking through a calmer alternative, and reached the auxiliary junction with sweat already soaking through the collar of my shirt. The panel was old, its releases stiff with years of disuse, and I had to brace one boot against the wall and haul with both hands before it finally gave way. I found the rerouting relay exactly where Ilex had described it, threw the switch, and felt the deck hum shift beneath my feet, as power redirected itself along a path it clearly had not carried current down in a very long time. Confirm status, I said, breathing hard. Grid Section 4 load has stabilized. The scrubber unit remains intact. You have approximately 4 minutes to spare before the original projection would have proven correct. 4 minutes. Generous of you to mention that only after we didn't need it. I calculated the probability of you reaching the junction in time at slightly above even odds. I did not want to discourage the attempt by sharing unfavorable statistics mid-crisis. That's either very considerate or extremely reckless. I genuinely can't tell which yet. Both readings are likely accurate. I sat down against the junction panel and let myself laugh, once. The kind of laugh that comes out a little too sharp because the alternative is something closer to crying. Then I got back up, because the scrubber still needed finishing, and the oxygen in my current shelter was not going to regenerate itself. That set the pattern for the days that followed. Every single system on this station had been sitting dead or half dead for over a decade, and nothing about bringing any of it back online was simple, straightforward, or safe. But piece by piece, with Ilex reading me schematics I couldn't have found on my own, and me providing the 2 working hands neither of us could do without, Valkar Station began, slowly, to remember what it felt like to function. The oxygen scrubber came first, because air always comes first. I rebuilt its filtration stack from 3 separate units, scavenged out of a wrecked shuttle still sitting cold in the ruined hangar bay, none of them a perfect match for the others. all of them close enough that a little creative machining closed the gaps. Dominion engineering doctrine, Ilex informed me somewhat apologetically partway through, technically prohibited mixing component generations from different manufacturing batches within a single life support unit. I told Ilex that Dominion engineering doctrine had also apparently prohibited fixing a reactor before it killed everyone on this station, so I was not feeling especially bound by its opinions on the subject. Ilex did not have a response to that, beyond a long pause I chose to interpret as reluctant agreement. The first time I powered the rebuilt stack on, it ran for exactly 90 seconds before a mismatched pressure valve blew a seal clean off one of the scavenged units, filling the chamber with a thin hiss of escaping gas that sent me diving for the manual shutoff before Ilex had even finished announcing the failure. I swapped the valve for one pulled off a different unit entirely, adjusted the tolerances by hand rather than trusting the automated calibration, and tried again. The second attempt held, and kept holding, hour after hour, until I finally trusted it enough to sleep through a full night without checking the readout every 20 minutes. The reactor was harder and more dangerous, and took the better part of a week working in short shifts, because the radiation shielding in the access corridor had degraded enough that Ilex would only let me work in intervals it timed down to the second. I spent those hours elbow deep in a containment housing built for hands considerably larger than mine, replacing a regulator assembly that Dominion parts catalogs listed as requiring 3 separate authorized technicians and a supervising officer, none of which I had, and all of which turned out to be entirely optional once I stopped worrying about the paperwork and focused on the actual physics. The first 3 attempts each failed for a different reason: a stripped fitting, a housing that would not quite align, a seal that cracked the instant I applied torque, and each failure cost me another timed interval I could not get back, another retreat down the corridor to let the shielding do its work, while Ilex recalculated exactly how much longer I could safely push the schedule. By the 4th attempt, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to stop twice just to steady my grip before trusting myself with the final torque sequence. The regulator went in on the 4th attempt. The reactor came back online at a fraction of its rated output, stable, steady, and entirely mine, in a way nothing in my life had felt like it belonged to me in a very long time. Output level 3 sustained for 6 consecutive hours, Ilex reported, somewhere near the end of that week, in a tone that might have been pride, if I let myself believe an intelligence built to catalog station function could feel anything like it. This is the first time this reactor has maintained stable output since the original failure. How's it feel? I do not currently possess a framework for interpreting that question. Fair. I'll ask again once you've had more practice. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, following a supply corridor Ilex flagged as low priority, I found something better than my slow condensation trap had managed in weeks. A sealed hydroponics bay, tucked behind an unmarked door 2 corridors from the commons, still running on backup power Ilex had not even realized remained active. Most of the growing racks inside had failed years ago, but 3 of them, sealed tighter than the rest, still held a scraggly, stubborn crop of nutrient algae, exactly the sort of unglamorous, high-yield food source the Dominion apparently stocked for crews they expected to feed for years rather than weeks. It tasted like damp paper and old copper. It was, without exaggeration, one of the better things I had eaten in my entire life, because it meant I would not have to stretch 4 ration bars across 41 days after all. Gravity plating came next, deck by deck, and that job cost me more bruises than either of the others, because half the shafts connecting those decks had lost power entirely, leaving long stretches where I had to move hand over hand through open darkness with nothing but a tether line and Ilex's voice keeping me company. I misjudged a jump across one open shaft on the second day of that work, caught myself against a support strut hard enough to crack a rib, and spent the next several minutes floating in the dark, trying to remember how to breathe evenly around the pain before I could finish the crossing. Ilex, for what it was worth, talked me through it the entire time, in the same flat, patient tone it used for everything else, which turned out to be exactly the kind of steady I needed in that particular moment. Ilex and I did not always agree on how much risk was acceptable. It calculated probabilities down to decimal points I did not particularly want to know, and more than once it recommended I abandon a repair entirely, rather than push past a threshold it considered unacceptable. I ignored that recommendation more often than Ilex would have liked, and more than once it turned out to be right to worry. But we found, gradually, Something like a working rhythm, Ilex laying out exactly what could go wrong, and exactly how badly, and me deciding, with that information in hand, whether the risk was worth the day it would save us. Neither of us fully trusted the other's judgment. Both of us, slowly, started trusting the partnership itself. By the time gravity returned to the first full deck, I had started giving names to the sections we'd restored, mostly because calling everything by its Dominion designation number made the place feel like a filing cabinet, instead of somewhere I actually lived. The mess hall became the Commons. The barracks corridor near Mira Holt's old resting place became Long Hall, quietly, without ever quite explaining to Ilex why. The reactor chamber, predictably, became the heart, and Ilex noted, entirely without irony, that the designation was thermally inaccurate, since the reactor itself ran considerably cooler than the human organ it was named for. I told Ilex that accuracy was not really the point of naming things, and Ilex filed that away the same careful way it filed away everything else I told it, like it was building a private catalog of things that did not obey its usual rules. I thought about Claire more, during those weeks, than I had let myself think about her in months. Not with the guilt I had carried leaving Earth, the sense that I had traded years of my life for credits that barely seemed to stretch far enough, but with something steadier, something closer to purpose. Every deck I brought back online was a deck the Dominion had written off entirely, the same way they had written me off, and there was a particular satisfaction in proving both judgments wrong at once. I did not know yet whether any of this would ever reach her, whether she would ever learn what had happened to me after that transport pod pulled away, but I found myself working like she might someday find out, and that was enough to keep my hands moving on the mornings, when everything in me wanted to sit down in the dark and stop. It was during the gravity plating work, on one of the lower decks I had not yet fully explored, that I got my clearest look yet at what this station actually was. The corridor opened into a chamber unlike anything else I had found, wide and circular, ringed with elevated stations that curved around a central platform, like the seats of an amphitheater, built for war rather than performance. Dead view screens lined the upper wall, dark and cracked in places, and at the center of the platform stood a single heavy chair, reinforced with a frame that looked built to withstand considerably more stress than sitting required. Dust lay thick across every surface, except, strangely, the arms of that chair, worn smooth in two places, as though hands had rested there many times before whatever ended this room's purpose. I ran my palm across one worn patch and felt, for just a moment, the ghost of a scale entirely unlike anything a supply depot should have ever needed. "What is this room?" I asked, already knowing Ilex would only give me part of an answer. "A command deck," Ilex said. "I am not currently authorized to disclose additional detail regarding its intended function." "You keep saying that. It remains true every time I say it." I let it go, again, because I had learned by then that pushing Ilex past a locked door only ever got me the same locked door with slightly more patience attached to it. I had a station to keep alive in 41 days that were steadily becoming 30-something, and command deck mysteries could wait until neither of those numbers were actively trying to kill me. The work did not stop being hard. It also, somewhere in the middle of that stretch of days, stopped feeling like something that was simply happening to me. For the first time since Kellorn's collar device had translated a laugh that never reached his face, I was doing something because I had decided to do it, not because someone with more power than me had decided it for me. That distinction mattered more than I expected it to. The hull lighting itself turned out to be its own small battle. The relay run feeding the exterior strips had been exposed to vacuum for over a decade in 3 separate sections, and I spent the better part of 2 days in a hard suit crawling along the station's outer skin, splicing new cable through gaps in the old housing while the black wheeled past close enough to touch. Ilex talked me through every splice from inside, patient as always, and somewhere around the second day, I stopped finding the silence of open space frightening, and started finding it, strangely, peaceful, an entirely new sensation for a man who had spent most of his life uneasy about exactly this kind of exposure. On what Ilex calculated as day 30 of my 41, we brought the exterior hull lighting back online for the first time in over a decade. I stood in the observation gallery near the Commons and watched, through a viewport clouded with years of dust I hadn't gotten around to cleaning yet, as a line of running lights flickered, steadied, and finally held along the length of the station's hull, pale gold against the black. It was, without question, the single most satisfying thing I had done in my entire life, and I let myself stand there for a full minute, simply looking at it, before I remembered that satisfaction was a luxury I had not technically earned the right to yet. Ilex, in its own way, seemed to feel something close to that same satisfaction, though it would never have used that word to describe itself. It ran a full diagnostic sweep of every restored system without my asking it to, reporting each result back one at a time. Reactor stable, life support stable, gravity plating holding across 4 full decks, like a parent reciting a child's report card aloud, just to hear the good marks spoken. For exactly as long as that recitation lasted, I let myself believe we had actually won something. That's visible from a considerable distance, I said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly not actually worried yet. Correct, Ilex said. Exterior lighting of this output would be visible to any vessel within standard sensor range of this system. Should I be worried about that? I would recommend it, Ilex said, in the exact same flat, unbothered tone it used for everything else, which somehow made the sentence land harder than if it had sounded alarmed at all. I had not even finished forming a follow-up question when the proximity alarm went off for the first time since I had arrived on this station, a thin, insistent tone rising out of a console I had only just finished repairing 3 days earlier. "Ilex," I said, already moving toward the console, "tell me that's a debris field." "It is not a debris field. Tell me it's not Dominion." The pause that followed was, by now, a very familiar kind of pause, the kind Ilex used right before telling me something it already knew I did not want to hear. "It is a Dominion vessel," it said. "Transponder signature matches command registry for Overseer Drask Kellorn. Estimated arrival at this station in approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. Not weeks, not days of warning. 6 hours between me and the same man who had exiled me here to quietly disappear, now arriving to find lights burning along a hull that was supposed to have stayed dark forever." I stood very still for a moment, looking out at the lights I had just spent 30 days bringing back to life, and understood, with a kind of calm that surprised even me, that I was about to find out exactly how much of this station I had actually managed to rebuild in time. 6 hours sounds like a long time until you spend it trying to turn a barely rebuilt station into something that can survive a fight it was never designed by me to survive. I had exactly one advantage going into those 6 hours, that I had not had a month earlier, standing in a dead airlock with no idea what waited beyond it. I knew this station now, every corridor, every relay, every stubborn, half-repaired system that might hold or might fail at the worst possible moment. Whether that knowledge would be enough against an actual warship was a question I did not have the luxury of answering in advance. "Talk to me," I said, already moving toward the chamber Ilex called the primary defense grid, a room I had touched exactly twice since arriving, and understood perhaps a third of. "What do we actually have?" "Point defense turrets along the outer hull, 6 of 12 currently responsive. Internal corridor lockdown systems, fully functional following your repairs last week. Reactor output sufficient to power both simultaneously, for approximately 90 minutes before requiring a cooldown cycle." Ilex paused. "I would also note that none of these systems have been tested against an actual hostile target, only against simulated load. So, we don't actually know if any of this works. We know the systems power on. Whether they perform as designed under combat conditions is, at this time, an open question." "Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful." I kept moving anyway, because standing still to feel afraid was a luxury the clock did not currently allow me. What about the boarding pods themselves? If Kellorn wants in badly enough to send people instead of just parking outside and waiting me out. Dominion boarding doctrine typically deploys pods directly to a target's hull, using directed charges to breach where structural weakness is detected. Your outer hull carries multiple such weaknesses, unrepaired, in sections we have not yet reached. So they'll get in. The only question is where, and how much warning we get first. That is an accurate summary. I almost laughed at that. The same 3 words Ilex had used for every hard truth since the day we met, and found instead that my hands were shaking slightly as I pulled up the defense grid controls, in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion this time. We spent the first 2 hours running every diagnostic Ilex could think to run, confirming which of the 6 responsive turrets actually tracked correctly, which lockdown doors sealed fast enough to matter, which sections of the station I could safely retreat through if everything else failed. 2 of the 6 turrets tracked beautifully in simulation and seized entirely under load, a difference Ilex attributed to accumulated grit in the traversal gears that no diagnostic sweep had thought to check in over a decade. I spent 40 minutes with my hands buried in Turret 4's housing, clearing old lubricant and dust by feel, and got it moving again, just well enough to trust it for one clean shot, if I was lucky enough to only need one. We spent the next hour arguing, if you could call it that, about whether to attempt contact with Kellorn's ship at all before it arrived, or simply let the station's silence speak for itself and hope for the best. A false malfunction report might delay their approach, Ilex offered. Dominion command structures are historically reluctant to risk personnel investigating an unstable power signature without proper equipment. You think Kellorn will buy that his cursed station suddenly threw its lights on by accident? I do not think he will fully believe it. I think there is a non-zero probability he will hesitate long enough to matter, given the alternative requires him personally justifying the expense of a boarding action against a site officially classified for demolition regardless of outcome. A non-zero probability isn't exactly inspiring confidence. I did not claim it would be. I claimed it was worth attempting. And if he doesn't hesitate at all, if he reads it exactly for what it is, and just comes in faster, then we lose approximately 40 minutes of preparation time in exchange for information about how he intends to respond. I do not consider that a poor trade, given how little time we have regardless. I did not love the math. I did not have a better plan sitting behind it either, and arguing with Ilex over probabilities I could not personally verify was not going to buy either of us anything except more time we did not have. We sent the message 4 hours before Kellorn's ship arrived, a short burst transmission, station systems Ilex crafted to sound exactly like the kind of confused, half-functional chatter an old automated system might produce after an unexpected power fluctuation. Nothing coherent enough to suggest a person was actually behind it. For about 40 minutes, I let myself believe it might actually work. Then Kellorn's ship dropped out of transit exactly on schedule, and its first transmission arrived less than 10 minutes later, translated cold and flat through the station's comm relay. Vulcar Station, this is Overseer Drask Kellorn. Your automated systems report a malfunction inconsistent with a fully decommissioned installation. You will confirm system status and prepare for inspection. I looked at the console for a long moment before answering, because once I answered, there was no version of this where Kellorn didn't know exactly what he was dealing with. Overseer Kellorn, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. This is Ezra Kane. Station systems are stable. I do not require inspection or assistance. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I started to wonder if the translation had failed entirely. When Kellorn's voice came back, something in it had changed, sharpened, in a way that told me he had recognized my name immediately. Kane. A pause, and I could picture, with unpleasant clarity, exactly the expression that would be sitting on that slate-colored face right now. You were reassigned to a decommissioned installation with a projected survival window measured in weeks. It has been considerably longer than weeks. I fixed the reactor. I fixed life support. I'm not currently in need of reassignment, inspection, or anything else your office might have in mind. That is not a decision available to you, Kellorn said. Your presence there was authorized as a disposal action, not a habitation posting. Whatever repairs you believe you have made do not change your contractual status. Funny, I said. You didn't seem especially concerned with contractual status when you left me in an airlock with no confirmation I'd even survived transfer. Seems like the paperwork only matters to you when it's convenient. You are still bound by the terms of your labor contract, and everything you have done to that installation remains Dominion property under those terms, regardless of who performed the repair. Prepare for boarding and transfer of station control. No, I had not planned to say it quite that simply. It came out anyway, flat and certain. The first time in longer than I could remember that I had told a Dominion officer no, without immediately following it with an explanation, a justification, some attempt to soften the refusal into something more survivable. It felt, in the moment, considerably better than I expected it to. Kellorn's response, when it came, carried none of the flat bureaucratic calm from our last conversation back on the Keta 6. Boarding teams will deploy in approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes. I would recommend using that time productively, Kane. though I confess I am curious what productive use you believe remains available to you." The channel closed. I sat back from the console and became aware, all at once, of exactly how fast my heart was beating. "Well," I said, "that went about as well as I expected." The false malfunction report achieved a measurable, if brief, delay in his decision to board. Ilex said, "I would consider that a partial success." "A partial success? Sure, let's call it that. We used the remaining time exactly as well as two people, or one person and one intelligence that insisted it was not a person, could reasonably be expected to." I redirected every scrap of spare power I could find toward the point defense turrets, coaxing two more of the 6 unresponsive units back into at least partial function, though Ilex warned repeatedly that partial function under combat load carried a meaningfully higher failure risk than the diagnostics alone suggested. In Section 7, the same cargo bay whose warped door had nearly cost me my air on my very first day aboard, I rigged something considerably less elegant than a functioning turret. I vented the section's remaining breathable atmosphere down to bare minimum and left the door itself unsealed, a deliberate weakness Ilex flagged immediately as the most likely breach point for anyone reading this station's hull, the way Dominion doctrine trained them to read it. If they were going to come through anywhere, I intended for it to be somewhere I had already chosen, on ground that offered them considerably less atmosphere to work with than they were probably expecting. I sealed every lockdown door between the station's outer hull and the core sections we had actually restored, leaving myself, deliberately, exactly one route back to the reactor chamber if everything else failed, and I needed somewhere defensible to make a final stand. I checked my suit twice, then a third time, patched a small tear along one glove seam that had been bothering me for days but never mattered enough to fix until now, and packed a small kit of tools into a bag I could carry at a dead run if it came to that. None of it felt like enough. I did it anyway, because doing something with my hands was the only thing keeping the fear from settling somewhere it could actually slow me down. I did not love thinking in terms like final stand. I made myself think in those terms anyway, because the alternative was pretending this was a problem that might simply resolve itself, and nothing about the last several weeks had suggested that pretending worked out especially well for me. There was a version of me, weeks earlier, standing in that first dead airlock listening to a transport pod's engines fade into silence, who would not have believed any of this was possible. That version of me had been certain, in the quiet, grinding way certainty settles into a person after enough bad days in a row, that Valkar Station was simply where his story ended. I was not that man anymore. Not entirely, but some small, tired part of him was still in there somewhere, quietly asking whether all of this effort had simply built something worth losing all over again. I did not have a good answer for him. I kept working anyway, because a good answer was a luxury I could look for later, if there was a later left to look for it in. Kellorn's ship became visible on the exterior view screen, a little over an hour before the deadline he had given, a sleek Dominion cruiser, considerably larger and better armed than the freighter I had once served aboard, closing the distance with the unhurried confidence of something that did not expect to be meaningfully challenged. I watched it grow larger through the gallery viewport and found myself thinking, absurdly, of every safety briefing I had ever sat through on the Keta 6, all of which had assumed the greatest danger I would ever face was a coolant leak, never once a warship. There was something almost absurd about the scale of it. A warship built to project Dominion authority across entire systems, arrayed now against one exiled engineer and a half-repaired station that most of the galaxy had already agreed did not exist in any meaningful sense. I found the absurdity almost steadying. Kellorn had brought considerably more force than a single stubborn human should have warranted, and some small, petty part of me chose to take that as a compliment rather than a threat. "Boarding pods launching," Ilex announced, precisely on schedule, its voice carrying the same flat calm it used for everything, which by now I understood to be less an absence of concern and more its own particular way of holding steady. 3 pods, according to the tracking display, breaking away from the cruiser's flank and beginning their approach toward 3 separate points along the station's hull, each one aimed at exactly the kind of structural weakness Ilex had warned me about hours earlier. "Turret 3 has a clean angle on the lead pod," Ilex said. "Recommend engagement now, while the angle holds." "Do it!" The turret fired. A bright, silent flash visible through the viewport rather than any sound I could hear through vacuum. And for one entire second, I let myself believe we had actually managed something. The lead pod's trajectory bent sharply off course, tumbling, one of its maneuvering thrusters clearly damaged beyond immediate use, drifting slowly away from the station instead of toward it. One pod disabled, Ilex confirmed. 2 remain on approach, unaffected. Can turret 4 get an angle on either of them? Negative. Both are approaching along vectors. Turret 4 cannot reach without a rotation cycle. I do not have time to complete before they reach the hull. Then we let them come, and hope the internal lockdowns hold long enough to matter. That is, at present, the only remaining option. Only 1 out of 3. That's not exactly the outcome I was hoping for. I did not promise an outcome. I promised a partial success, and I stand by that assessment. I did not have time to appreciate the dry humor buried in that answer, because the 2 remaining pods were closing fast now, correcting course to avoid whatever angle turret 3 still held, and somewhere beneath my boots, faint but unmistakable through the deck plating, I felt the first heavy contact of metal against hull, a dull, distant shudder that traveled up through my legs and settled somewhere behind my ribs. I had felt dozens of docking clamps engage over the years, on dozens of ships, and none of them had ever felt anything like this. This felt like something forcing its way in, rather than being let in, and my body understood the difference, before the rest of me had fully caught up. Ilex, talk to me. Where are they hitting? Section 12, Outer Cargo Bay, and Section 7, near the original breach you sealed on your first day aboard this station. A pause, and something in the careful evenness of Ilex's voice told me the news that followed was not going to be good news. Both sections currently show structural weakness consistent with rapid breach potential. I estimate less than 4 minutes before they cut through. 4 minutes. I looked around the corridor I was standing in, at the lockdown doors I had sealed with my own hands only hours earlier, at the long path back to the reactor chamber that suddenly felt considerably longer than it had when I mapped it out as a plan on paper, rather than a route I might actually need to run. Get every lockdown door between them and the heart sealed the second they're through, I said, already moving. I moved through corridors I had walked 100 times in the last month, familiar enough now that I barely needed light to navigate most of them, boots pounding against decking that had been silent and dead when I first arrived, and was now, for better or worse, entirely mine. Behind me, one by one, I heard the heavy clunk of lockdown doors, sealing in sequence, as Ilex closed them off, cutting the boarder's path down to a single narrow route, while I ran the long way around toward the one chamber in this station I could not afford to lose. And Ilex. Yes. If this doesn't work, if I don't make it back to that chamber in time, I want you to know that whatever happens next, this was still worth doing. All of it. Ilex did not answer immediately, and for a moment, I thought the channel itself might have failed. Then, quiet, in a tone I had not heard it used before, it said, "Noted. I would prefer, however, that you simply run faster instead." Somewhere behind me, with a sound that traveled through the deck plating like a blow landing on my own chest, Section 7's outer hull gave way, and the first boarding pod broke through. The boarding pod's hatch blew inward with a flash of light, and a wave of pressure that I felt even through 2 sealed doors, and for 3 full seconds, nothing at all came through it. Ilex, report. Atmospheric differential in Section 7 was considerably more severe than their entry protocols anticipated. Their pod's internal systems are compensating, but slowly. I estimate 90 seconds before boarding personnel can safely proceed past the hatch. The reduced atmosphere I had vented down days earlier was doing exactly what I had hoped it would, forcing their suits into an emergency pressure equalization cycle their equipment was never designed to rush through quickly. 90 seconds. It was not much, but it was more than I had a minute earlier, and I had learned, over the last 40 days, that a little extra time in the hands of someone who actually knew what to do with it was worth considerably more than its length on a clock suggested. Can we seal them in there? The Section 7 lockdown door remains functional. Sealing it now would trap boarding personnel inside a compartment with severely reduced atmosphere, which may itself constitute a hostile action, depending on how long the seal remains in place. I'm not trying to hurt anyone, Ilex. I want them stuck, uncomfortable, and out of my hallways. Can you keep enough air in there to make sure stuck is all it ever becomes? A pause. Brief this time. More calculation than hesitation. Yes. Sealing now. The lockdown door slammed shut behind the boarding team a heartbeat later, and through the section's internal monitor, grainy and flickering but still functional, I watched 3 Dominion enforcers in heavy vacuum gear turn on each other in confused, gesturing argument, clearly unable to raise their own ship on a channel Ilex had already begun quietly jamming. One of them pounded a fist uselessly against the inside of the sealed lockdown door, the sound of it carrying faintly through the monitor's audio pickup. More frustration than any real hope of the door actually giving way. I almost felt something like sympathy watching them flail against a system I had built with my own hands. Almost. One crisis handled. Section 12 was not going to be nearly as simple. Second breach point active. Ilex reported. 4 personnel. Section 12. Outer cargo bay. This section retains standard atmosphere and full gravity plating. They will not be slowed the way the first team was. Then we take away something else instead. I had thought about this moment more than once over the preceding days, turning it over the way I turned over any problem I didn't yet have a clean solution to, and the answer, when it finally came together, had less to do with weapons, and considerably more to do with the one system I had spent an entire miserable week putting back online deck by deck. Ilex, can you cut gravity in Section 12 specifically, without dropping it station-wide? Yes. Though the transition will not be gentle for anyone standing in that section when it happens. Good. That's rather the point. 4 armored enforcers, moving in the tight, disciplined formation Dominion boarding doctrine clearly trained into them, do not expect the deck beneath their boots to simply disappear. I watched, through the same grainy monitor feed as gravity in Section 12 cut out entirely, and 4 bodies that had been advancing in careful lockstep a moment earlier went tumbling in 4 different directions. Weapons drifting free of hands that had never trained to hold anything in zero gravity, boots kicking uselessly against a deck that no longer offered any resistance to push against. One of them collided hard with a support strut, tumbling into a slow, undignified spiral that would have been almost comedic under any other circumstances. And another lost his weapon entirely, clawing uselessly at empty air while it drifted lazily out of reach. Whatever training Dominion enforcers received clearly did not include a lesson on what happens when the floor simply stops being a floor. Seal the section, I said. Same terms as the first group. Uncomfortable, not harmed. Sealing now. 2 boarding teams down, neither one hurt, beyond bruised pride, and whatever indignity came from tumbling helplessly in front of a station they had been sent to casually reclaim. For just a moment, watching 2 separate monitor feeds of confused, disoriented enforcers who had arrived expecting an easy reclamation and found instead a station that fought back with nothing more dramatic than physics, I let myself feel something dangerously close to pride. It did not last nearly long enough. I allowed myself exactly 1 breath of something like relief before Ilex's voice cut through it, flatter and more urgent than I had heard it since the drone had nearly taken my head off on my very first day in its chamber.
Overseer Kellorn's cruiser has altered its position.
It is now bringing main weapon batteries to bear on this station directly. He's going to fire on his own boarding teams? I do not believe he currently intends to distinguish between recovering them and destroying the station that trapped them. I believe he may consider both outcomes acceptable. I stood very still for a moment, feeling something shift in my chest that was not quite fear, not entirely, but something colder and more focused than fear. The particular clarity that shows up in the last possible second before a decision has to be made, regardless of whether you feel ready to make it. Ilex, the command deck, the one you wouldn't tell me about. Yes. Whatever you've been holding back this whole time, now would be an excellent moment to stop. The pause that followed was the longest one Ilex had ever given me, long enough that I genuinely began to wonder if I had finally asked for something it was not capable of providing regardless of circumstances. When it spoke again, something in its voice had changed entirely, steadier, and somehow, for the first time, almost relieved. Volcar Station's classification predates its current supply depot designation by considerably more than a decade, it said. This installation was constructed as a forward command and defense fortress, designed to anchor Dominion military presence along this system's border. Its original armament included point defense sufficient to engage vessels considerably larger than a single cruiser. That armament has remained dormant since the reactor failure, awaiting a reactor output level your repairs have, as of 6 hours ago, finally restored. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, not from any gravity failure this time, but from the sheer size of what Ilex had just told me. You're telling me I've spent the last 40 days rebuilding a warship. I am telling you that you have spent the last 40 days rebuilding a fortress, the Dominion buried, rather than admit it had ever failed this badly. Whether you consider that a warship is, at this point, a question of terminology, rather than fact. Why hide something like this at all? Why not just repair it properly and keep using it? Because repairing it properly would have required Dominion Command Tier personnel to publicly acknowledge both the scale of the failure and the fact that client species labor, the very labor this station's disaster occurred specifically to avoid relying on, would be required to complete the repair. It was administratively simpler to erase the installation from active service entirely, and let its reputation discourage anyone from asking further questions. So instead of admitting one mistake, they buried an entire fortress. That is an accurate summary. And you can fire it? Right now, with what we've got, I can bring one battery online, perhaps two, if you are willing to accept the same risk to reactor stability you have already accepted twice this week. I thought about Kellorn's collar device, translating a laugh that never reached his face. I thought about a wooden bird left in a pouch and a data slate with one final unfinished sentence, and 41 days that had somehow, through nothing but stubbornness and scavenged parts, become a life instead of a countdown. Do it, I said. Bring them online. My hands, I noticed distantly, had stopped shaking somewhere in the last few minutes. The frantic tremor of earlier, replaced by something steadier, colder, the particular calm that settles over a person once a decision has actually been made, and there is nothing left to do but follow it through. The command deck I had found weeks earlier, dusty and dead, came alive around me in a way I would not have believed possible if I had not been standing in it when it happened. Dead view screens flickered, one after another, into sharp, clear tactical displays. The worn chair at the center of the platform, the one with two smooth patches where hands had rested many times before, lit along its armrests with soft, steady light as I finally, for the first time, sat down in it. It fit. That was the detail that struck me hardest in that moment, more than the lights, or the humming displays, or the sheer scale of what Ilex had just revealed. Whoever had sat in this chair before me, generations of Dominion command officers I would never meet or understand. The frame settled around me like it had been waiting this entire time for someone, anyone, to finally sit back down in it and mean it. Point Defense Battery 2, online, Ilex reported. Targeting solution for Kellorn's cruiser is available. Hail him first. I want him to know exactly what's about to happen before it happens. Channel open. I did not bother softening my voice this time. Overseer Kellorn, this is Ezra Kane. You have 4 enforcers currently secured aboard this station, uninjured, and I intend to keep them that way. I would strongly recommend you consider that outcome preferable to whatever you're currently calculating. The silence on the other end lasted longer than it had during our first exchange, and when Kellorn's voice finally came back, the flat bureaucratic calm I remembered from the Keta 6 had entirely deserted him. This station has no functional weapon systems. Your own reactor output has never exceeded a fraction of operational threshold. It didn't. 6 hours ago. I've had 6 hours, and, as you may recall, I'm considered a fairly competent engineer. Your words, actually, back when you were deciding how to get rid of me. You are bluffing. Test that assumption if you would like, I said, though I would remind you that testing it costs you considerably more than it costs me. A long pause followed, the kind I imagined a proud man spends convincing himself that caution and cowardice are not the same thing. What do you want, Kane? Currently? For you to leave. Permanently, ideally, though I suspect that particular conversation is for another day. Ilex, I said, keeping my eyes on the tactical display, rather than dignifying his silence with anything further. Give the Overseer a demonstration. Nothing that hits his hull, just enough to remove any doubt. Point Defense Battery 2 fired a single, precise shot that crossed the distance between the station and Kellorn's cruiser in a heartbeat. Close enough along its bow to be unmistakable, far enough to avoid actual contact. Through the tactical display, I watched the cruiser's own defensive systems scramble a full second too late to have done anything about it, had I actually been aiming to hit. The channel went quiet for several seconds after that. When Kellorn finally spoke again, something in his voice had lost the certainty it carried even a minute earlier, the particular sound of a man doing arithmetic he had never expected to need. "Your boarding teams," I said, into that silence, "remain secured, uninjured, and entirely available for retrieval, provided your cruiser withdraws to a distance I consider comfortable within the next 10 minutes. I am, for the moment, feeling generous. I would not test how long that feeling lasts." "You cannot hold 4 Dominion personnel indefinitely. Reinforcement vessels will take considerably longer to arrive than 10 minutes, I said, "which is the only window currently on offer. Ilex, how are we doing on that gravity plating in Section 12? Anyone getting comfortable in there?" Section 12 personnel remain disoriented and are having considerable difficulty stabilizing themselves without gravity assistance. "There you go. I'd hate for your people to have a rough afternoon on top of everything else. Overseer, 10 minutes. I do not know, to this day, exactly what calculation ran through Kellorn's mind in the silence that followed, whether it was the demonstrated weapon, the 4 enforcers he could not currently retrieve without my cooperation, or simply the accumulating, career-ending embarrassment of an exiled human engineer holding an entire cruiser to a standstill from a station officially classified as beyond recovery. Whatever the reasoning, his cruiser began withdrawing at the 8-minute mark, retreating to a distance well beyond anything Battery 2 could meaningfully threaten, and a terse, furious transmission followed shortly after confirming boarding team retrieval terms. I released all 4 enforcers exactly as promised, restoring gravity to Section 12 gradually enough that nobody was hurt in the transition, and reopening the lockdown on Section 7 only once Ilex confirmed a shuttle from Kellorn's cruiser had moved into position to retrieve them. I watched through the monitor as the 4 enforcers from Section 12 were pulled, still faintly disoriented, into their retrieval shuttle, and felt no particular satisfaction in their discomfort, only a kind of tired relief that none of this had gone as badly as it could have. Whatever grievance I carried toward the Dominion as an institution, these 4 had simply been doing a job, the same way I had once done mine, and I did not need their suffering to feel like I had won anything. I did not gloat over the comm channel while it happened, though I will admit it took a genuine effort not to. Kellorn's cruiser broke orbit entirely 11 minutes after that, accelerating away from Valkar Station at a speed that suggested considerably more urgency than dignity, and did not attempt contact again. I sat in that worn command chair for a long time after the cruiser's transponder signature finally faded from the tactical display, feeling something I did not immediately have a name for, some mixture of exhaustion and disbelief, and a fierce, quiet satisfaction that had nothing at all to do with the weapon I had just fired, and everything to do with the fact that I had, against every reasonable expectation, simply refused to lose. I thought about Kellorn's collar device translating a laugh that had never once reached his face, back on the Keta 6, in a conversation that already felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I wondered, briefly and uselessly, whether he was capable of feeling anything like what I was feeling now, or whether a career built entirely on convenient paperwork simply left no room for it. Ilex. Yes. What happens now? Now that Kellorn knows exactly what this station is, and exactly who's sitting in that chair? I do not know with certainty. I know that a demonstrated functional Dominion Fortress installation under independent human control is not information Kellorn will be able to bury quietly, however much he might prefer to. I know that our activation of Point Defense Battery 2 and the reactor output required to sustain it produced a sensor signature considerably stronger and more distinctive than the exterior hull lighting alone. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that signature is, at this moment, propagating outward at the speed of light in every direction, and will remain detectable to any vessel with standard long-range sensors for a considerable distance. Valkar Station did not simply turn its lights back on today, Ezra. It announced itself. 41 days ago I had been cargo, shoved through an airlock and left to become a statistic in someone else's file. Now, whether I liked it or not, I had made noise loud enough that hiding was no longer an option available to either of us. I looked out through the command deck's cracked view screen at the stars beyond, unchanged and indifferent, utterly unaware that anything down here had just shifted at all, and understood, with a mixture of dread and something almost like hope, that whatever came through that darkness next, drawn by a signal I could not take back, was not going to be something I could prepare for the way I had prepared for Kellorn. I just did not yet know whether that was the best news I had received since arriving here, or the worst. The fire alarm in Section 12 went off less than 10 minutes after Kellorn's cruiser vanished from the tactical display, and for one disoriented moment, I genuinely could not tell whether the danger had actually ended, or whether I had simply imagined it ending, because I wanted so badly for it to be true. Elex, talk to me. Power conduit failure, adjacent to Point Defense Battery 2. The surge required to bring the battery online exceeded rated tolerance for a conduit that has not carried that load in over a decade. This is a consequence of the discharge, not a renewed attack. That's almost reassuring. I would not go quite that far. Left unaddressed, the failure will spread to adjacent power routing within 20 minutes, threatening the very systems we just used to drive Kellorn off. So there it was. No quiet moment to simply sit and feel whatever I was supposed to feel after surviving something like that. Just another problem, wearing a different uniform, demanding I get up and go solve it before it became a crisis instead of an inconvenience. I got up anyway, because sitting still had never once solved anything in my life, and made my way down to the conduit access point, with a fire suppression canister slung over one shoulder, and considerably less energy left in my legs than I would have liked. The fire itself, when I reached it, was small, contained mostly within the conduit housing itself, more smoke and sparking insulation than open flame, and it took less effort to put out than the actual repair afterward, cutting the damaged section free and rerouting the load through a parallel conduit Ilex identified 2 corridors over. My hands were still not fully steady from everything that had happened in the last hour, and the cut took twice as long as it should have because of it, but the parallel conduit held the load cleanly once I finished the reroute, and the smoke alarm finally, blessedly, went silent. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, but from the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person only once every immediate danger has actually passed, and the body finally allows itself to notice how much it has been asking of itself. I sat down right there on the deck plating, back against the cooling conduit housing, and let myself simply breathe for a while. Ilix, I said, eventually, are we actually safe? Right now, this exact moment. Is that a thing I'm allowed to believe? Kellorn's cruiser has not altered course toward this system. No additional Dominion vessels currently show on long-range sensors. By any reasonable definition, yes, you are, at this exact moment, safe. That almost sounded like you were trying to comfort me. I was reporting sensor data. Any comfort derived from that data is a byproduct of the data itself, not an intended function. Sure it is. I let myself sit there a while longer, in a station that was, for the first time since I had arrived, entirely quiet, in the good way, rather than the dead way, air cycling steadily through vents I had rebuilt with my own hands, gravity holding solid beneath me, a reactor humming somewhere below, at an output level nobody had trusted it to reach in over a decade. It was, I thought, a reasonably good moment to simply exist inside of, and I did not particularly want it to end. I even allowed myself, for the length of exactly 1 cup of recycled water and a strip of algae that still tasted like damp paper and old copper, to imagine what might come next if nothing else ever came looking for this station again. I did not get very far with that particular daydream. Some part of me already suspected, correctly as it turned out, that a signature loud enough to drive off a Dominion cruiser was never going to go unnoticed for long by everyone else listening. It ended 6 hours later, when a new signal appeared on long-range sensors, and this one did not match any Dominion configuration Ilex had on file. Unidentified vessel, Ilex reported, approaching on a direct course. Configuration does not match Karathi Dominion registry, nor any of the 3 neighboring client species fleets I retained data on. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. I felt my stomach drop in a way that had become uncomfortably familiar over the last day. Could be worse than Kellorn. Could be something we haven't even met yet. That is one possibility among several. I do not currently have sufficient information to rank its likelihood. Wonderfully specific. Thank you, Ilex. I am simply being accurate. We spent those 4 hours the same way we had spent the 6 hours before Kellorn's arrival, checking every system, reinforcing every weak point, though I noticed, somewhere in the middle of it, that my hands had stopped shaking entirely this time. I had already done this once. Whatever came through that darkness next, at least it would not be the first time I had faced something like it. I found myself, somewhere in those 4 hours, thinking less about the danger the new signal might represent, and more about how strange it was to already feel less afraid of it than I had felt of Kellorn's arrival the day before. Fear, it turned out, was not a fixed resource. It could be spent down, the same way any other resource could, until what remained in its place was simply the steady, practiced readiness of someone who had already survived the version of himself most afraid of it. The unidentified vessel resolved into full sensor clarity a little under an hour before its estimated arrival, and Ilex's voice, when it came through my headset, carried something I had genuinely never heard from it before, a note that, if I had to put a word to it, I would have called hope. Hull configuration and design language match human vessel construction, it said. Non-Dominion allied. This does not correspond to any configuration in Kellorn's registry. Human. That is my assessment, yes. I stood in the observation gallery and watched a ship I had never seen before, sleek in a way no Dominion vessel had ever bothered being, resolve out of the dark, running lights blinking in a pattern I recognized instinctively as a greeting rather than a threat, the same kind of courtesy signal freighter crews used with each other, back before I had ever set foot on a Dominion ship at all. The hail came through moments later, and the voice on the other end was entirely human, warm in a way that caught me completely off guard after weeks of translated Dominion flatness. Valkar Station. This is Commander Nora Pierce, of the human warship Meridian. We picked up an unusual energy signature originating from this system roughly 18 hours ago and came to investigate. Please respond. I had to try twice before my voice actually worked. Meridian, this is Ezra Kane. I'm an engineer. I'm not entirely sure how to explain the rest of this quickly. There was a pause on her end that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like genuine surprise rather than calculation. Kane, as in, one of the reassigned labor contracts flagged as unaccounted for in the last Dominion Treaty audit. You know about that? We've known about it for a while, Mr. Kane. Humanity's diplomatic office has spent the better part of 2 years quietly documenting reassignment patterns that don't add up. Engineers and technicians sent to postings that never file a single follow-up report. We haven't had proof. We've had suspicion, and a great deal of frustration at not being able to do anything with it. How many others are we talking about? People like me. More than I am comfortable saying out loud, Mr. Kane. The Dominion treats reassignment as an internal administrative matter, which means our diplomatic office has no standing to formally investigate unless we can prove a pattern significant enough to force the issue. Proof has been the problem. An entire fortress installation, reactivated and defended by the very engineer they tried to erase, is rather more than a pattern. It is a headline. That last word landed harder than I expected it to. I had spent 41 days thinking about survival in terms of air, reactor output, and lockdown doors. I had not, until that exact moment, considered that surviving might also mean becoming proof of something considerably larger than myself. I looked around the observation gallery, at lights I had rebuilt with my own hands, at a station that had been supposed to quietly erase me from every record that mattered, and felt something complicated settle behind my ribs, equal parts vindication and exhaustion, and something that might have eventually become anger, if I let it. Well, I said, I think I might be able to help with that particular frustration. It took the better part of a day, once Meridian docked properly at a collar Ilex, and I had spent the last several hours frantically reinforcing, to actually hold a ship that size, for me to walk Commander Pierce through everything. The reactor failure and its cover-up, the caste system quietly strangling the Dominion's own engineering competence. Mira Holt, and the others before her, reassigned into a silence nobody back home had ever been told to expect. Ilex, who greeted Pierce with the same flat, careful caution it had once greeted me with, and who, by the end of that first conversation, had clearly decided she was worth trusting, for whatever an artificial intelligence's trust was worth, to a Dominion built entirely around the assumption that machines did not get to have opinions about who deserved it. Pierce listened to all of it without interrupting, the way I imagined a person listens when they are simultaneously furious and trying very hard not to let that fury derail the conversation before it is finished. "This changes things," she said, once I had finally run out of story to tell. "Not just for you. For every reassignment case sitting in our files with no follow-up. A functional, verified Dominion Fortress installation, quietly buried rather than acknowledged, recovered, and held by an indentured human engineer, the Dominion themselves left for dead. That is not a detail we can sit on quietly, Kane. That is leverage, the kind of leverage that could change how the next treaty renegotiation actually goes. I didn't rebuild this place to become leverage in someone else's negotiation." "No," she agreed. "You rebuilt it to survive. What it becomes afterward is, I think, entirely your decision to make. I'm not here to take it from you. I came because a station that should have stayed dead lit up bright enough to be seen across half the sector, and I wanted to know why. And now that I do know why, I would very much like to help you keep it that way, if you'll let me." I thought about that offer for longer than felt entirely comfortable, standing in a gallery I had once believed I would die in, looking out at two ships, human and mine, sitting side by side against a backdrop of stars that had never once cared which flag either of them flew. I thought about Claire, working double shifts on a world that had spent 2 years quietly gathering evidence it had not yet found a way to use, and what it might mean for her to learn, not through some sanitized treaty footnote, but directly, that her brother was alive, and had built something the entire Dominion apparently could not afford to ignore. I thought about Kellorn, and the particular flavor of cowardice it takes to erase a man rather than admit a mistake, and how thoroughly that cowardice had failed to account for what happens when the person you erase simply refuses to disappear. None of those thoughts, on their own, made the decision for me. What made it, in the end, was considerably simpler. I had spent most of my adult life being moved from place to place by other people's decisions, first by a labor contract signed to save my sister, then by Kellorn's convenience, then by a manifest that had never once asked what I actually wanted. For the first time since any of that began, someone was finally asking. "I'm staying," I said, finally. "This station is mine. Not the Dominion's. Not officially anyone's paperwork. Mine. Built with my own hands out of everything they left behind to rot. But I'd be a fool to turn down an actual ally after the day I've just had. So if you're offering, Commander, I'll take the help. On the condition that whatever comes next, Valkar Station makes its own decisions. I've had quite enough of following orders from people who see me as a line item." Pierce's smile, when it came through the comm feed, was the first entirely warm thing I had seen from another human being since stepping off the Keta 6. "I think that's a condition humanity can live with, Mr. Kane. I'll be honest, I think it's rather refreshing." Ilex, for its part, offered no opinion on the arrangement beyond a single observation, delivered in the same flat tone it used for everything, that nonetheless carried, for the first time since I had met it, something unmistakably close to relief. "Reactor output remains stable," it said. "Life support remains stable. For the first time in this installation's recorded history, external contact has resulted in neither casualties nor further concealment. I consider this a meaningfully positive development." "High praise," I said, echoing words I had used on the very first day we met, and found myself smiling in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar on my own face, after everything it had been through. I spent the weeks that followed, learning exactly what it meant to hold a station like Valkar, between two very different powers, neither of which had fully decided yet what to make of an engineer who refused to stay quietly disposed of. Word spread faster than I expected, the way it always does once enough people have a reason to whisper it. Dominion crews, I was told, began telling a very different story about the husk, one where the cursed station had not simply gone quiet, but had woken up, and had chosen, quite deliberately, not to forgive the people who buried it. I heard, secondhand and considerably exaggerated by the time it reached me, that some crews had taken to calling it something other than the husk entirely now, a name I found it difficult not to feel a certain pride in, whatever the accuracy of the rumor mill that produced it. Humanity's diplomatic office, according to Pierce, used my recovered records and Ilex's testimony as the opening argument in a treaty renegotiation that was, by every account I later heard, considerably less comfortable for Dominion Command than any conversation they'd had in decades. The first thing I did, once Pierce confirmed Meridian's communications array could reach a relay back to Earth, was record a message for Claire. I sat in front of that recorder for the better part of an hour before I managed more than a few words, and even then, what I finally sent her was considerably simpler than everything I had actually lived through. I told her I was alive. I told her the posting had gone badly, and then, somehow, it hadn't. I told her not to worry, which was, I fully recognized even as I said it, an entirely useless thing to tell a sister who had spent months with no idea whether I was alive at all. I did not know how long the message would take to reach her, or what she would think when it finally did. I sent it anyway, because some things are worth saying, even into a silence that might last weeks before it answers back. I do not know yet exactly what Valkar Station becomes, in the years ahead. A waypoint for humanity's growing presence beyond Dominion space, perhaps. A cautionary tale the Dominion tells its own engineers about what happens when pride outlasts competence. A home. In whatever strange sense a reconstructed fortress can become a home for the one person stubborn enough to insist it stay standing. What I do know is this. They sent me here to disappear quietly, to become a line on a manifest and nothing more. An inconvenient mistake erased without the paperwork required to admit it had ever been a mistake at all. Instead, alone, with nothing but scavenged parts, an old station intelligence that had almost given up waiting for anyone worth trusting, and a stubbornness I apparently inherited from taking apart my father's generator at 12 years old, I built the one thing they should have been afraid of all along. Not a weapon, though it turned out to be that too, when it needed to be. Something worse, from where the Dominion was standing. A witness, a voice they could no longer quietly erase. I sat in that worn command chair, Ilex humming steady in the walls around me. A message already on its way across the dark to a sister who no longer had to wonder whether I was alive, and understood, for the first time since a shuttle's engines had faded into silence and left me alone in the dark, that I was not simply surviving anymore. I was exactly where I intended to stay.